You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DMRadio, the world's longest-running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on the show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh is here. And yes, indeed, we've got an all-star cast for you once again. Today, we're going to dive into really one of the biggest topics in the world of enterprise computing. It's all about the cloud, right? The cloud is the new center of gravity. Of course, on-prem data centers were the center of gravity for many, many years. And they're not going away, folks, anytime soon. I think the rumors of the on-prem data centers demise have been greatly exaggerated indeed. But nonetheless, cloud is now the new center of gravity. So what does that mean? Well, you want your data to be close to your applications, right? And the big cloud players have availability zones. That's where our title came from today. But there are lots of other issues to come into play here. There's hot storage, cold storage, hybrid cloud architecture. There's a lot of stuff you have to do to be able to get this right. But I can promise you that the companies that are looking into this, that they're trying to figure out how it's going to work for them, what kind of architecture they need, what kind of tools and technologies they need to enable their business to do better, to succeed in the modern world. Well, that's what our guests are going to tell us about today. We're going to hear from Garima Kapoor from a cool company called Min.io. We've got Gary Ogasawara. He is from a company called Cloudian. And last but not least, we'll talk to David Feller from a company called Spectra Logic. But let's go ahead and dive right in. You know, I've been tracking enterprise software for 20 plus years now, and it's a fascinating journey we've been on. And we've really learned so much in the last 10 years. I think that the last 5 years have just been white hot with innovation, with very clever ways of being able to enable multi-cloud, hybrid cloud environments where you have data on-prem, you have data in a private cloud, you have data in the public cloud. How do you sort of weave together the big picture to where that all makes sense and doesn't cause your developers or your business people or your customers lots of headaches? So with that, let me go ahead and bring in Garima Kapoor from Min.io. Tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing in the space of cloud storage.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Pleasure to be here. Hi, this is Garima. I'm one of the founders and COO at Min.io. I'm responsible for driving the business operations. We founded Min.io back in 2014, and our goal has been to be AWS S3 for rest of the world. So from 0 lines of code back in 2014 to now, we have around 1.1 million Docker downloads a day. So we have a bigger ecosystem now, more than AWS itself. And in essence, what Min.io is, it is open source, software-defined, Kubernetes native, high-performant object store. You can download the software from our website and get your object storage, AWS S3 compatible object storage within minutes, and get started building with your applications.
Yeah, that's just amazing. I mean, and you folks have really nailed what is now a whole new way of doing business in the software world. Some people call it product-led growth, where you literally give the product away. You open source the technology, you give the product away, you get it into the hands of developers so they can try it and work with it and do things with it. And then you market to those people, right? So they're already using your stuff. So I'm sure in a fairly soft way, you reach out and say, hey, or you may even notice that usage goes up for a particular client. So you're like, but they're ready to go enterprise grade. Just explain real quick for the general audience what this product-led growth is all about in the open source movement.
Absolutely. I think, first of all, cloud is built on open source. If you see all the foundational stack when it comes to even cloud technologies, whether it is Kubernetes, whether it is now with Min.io object storage as well. So the foundational technologies are mostly object store from databases to streaming engines and whatnot. So it is very important that you capture the hearts and minds of the application developers very early on as they're building to this stack. And object storage is so fundamental to when you're building the applications, because applications are becoming stateless. So the states need to be held in object store. So object store gets plugged into the system very early on when these application developers are building their stack. And once that stack becomes mature, they can just deploy it anywhere they want. So as and as this technology gets matured, we get engaged very early on and get to the production level. And that is where the product-led growth necessarily comes into play. So I think for today's world where, everyone from application point of view, they just want something to just work at the end of the day. Simplicity is very important. Being part of the entire ecosystem and software stack is very important, whether from Kubernetes standpoint, whether having application ecosystem from analytics and database standpoint. It's very important to be very early on as part of the stack. And as that gets matured, it is very natural for your technology to get built in as part of the production environment, and that leads to the commercial engine overall. So I think product-led growth is the way forward for software-defined product and even for service-oriented products. That is how software is going to be consumed in future. And if you see other companies in this space which have been very successful, like Atlassian and others, they have all led to product-led growth, and that also leads to a lot of efficiency in the business model overall, reduced operational overhead, increased margin, and so on. So product-led growth has a lot of benefits attached to it, especially, and if you attach open source next to it, then it just goes on its own exponential tangent overall.
Yeah, that's a lot of really good information you just threw out there. And one term caught my ear in particular. You were referring to cloud native architectures and designing products such that they are cloud native, which basically means you can design it in its little capsule and then deploy it wherever. You can deploy it on Amazon, you can deploy it in Google Cloud Platform, which is so wonderful because having to design for multiple different endpoints has always been a pain. It always will be a pain.
It is.
Right. So, but you made another really good quote, which is that the cloud is built on open source. One of the coolest things to me about looking at cloud architecture and how all these new applications are being designed is that we really have baked in so many best practices from the on-prem world over the years, whether it be authentication or single pane of glass or whatever, or really just the capturing of metadata. Who logged in when from what machine, how long were they in, what did they touch? These are audit trails, that kind of stuff. I mean, it did exist in the on-prem world. It does exist, but it's a bit harder to navigate. And so I think what we saw is that open source inspired everyone. And as you said, because of that, it formed the foundation of what is the cloud computing world today, right?
Absolutely. And like I said earlier in our conversation, from us and our conversations with the customer, cloud is more of a mindset. It's more of an operational model than, a physical place where the data is hosted. Cloud was synonymous to public cloud 5 years back or 6 years back when we were early on. But now, as customers are, starting on their journey of being cloud native and more cloud first as an organization, they are thinking about all workloads, like you mentioned in your introduction as well. The applications, wherever the data is, cloud needs to be there, and that's what Minayo-like products bring to you. Like you can deploy it anywhere, whether it is on edge, whether it is on your colo, and whether it is in the cloud. You get the consistent storage experience for all your applications. Because data has gravity. Compute, it's very easy to move around compute. You can containerize it, take it anywhere you need to go. So compute is the easy part. Data is where the gravity is. And if you see how the scale of data has increased just over the last couple of years, it has been insane. When we started the company, we were talking in terabytes, and now it's just multiple petabytes in first conversation itself that we get involved with the customer. So the scale has changed dramatically. Data has gravity to it, and it's very difficult to rewrite those applications for every single underlying storage environment. So
that's right.
From customer standpoints, it's very important that customers standardize on an industry-specific API, which is now S3 API, thanks to Amazon AWS, who have led this whole defining of object storage and also leading the way when it comes to defining the industry standard API. And Minayo gives the customers the ability to have a consistent underlying storage infrastructure no matter where they go. You go to public cloud, Google Cloud, Azure, they're all incompatible with AWS. Now, if you need to move your applications from AWS to any other cloud, you need Minayo. Further, for even disaster recovery reasons, right? If you are just in AWS, if AWS goes down, what happens to your applications, right? So for that, you need replication across different clouds, different environments, on-prem, public clouds, whatever that might be. Minayo gives you that ability of active replication. So your data is available all the time for your applications to access. So I think as long as the customers standardize on the industry standard APIs and keep the control of the software stack to themselves, their cloud journey will become very easy and seamless in future rather than, just getting stuck with one vendor or one public cloud overall. So and customers are taking it very seriously as they're, thinking about a bigger strategic decision, especially from CIO's perspective.
Yeah, sure. And just to really quickly explain for our audience out there, in a sense, Minayo sits in between the consumer of the information and the provider of the information, and you serve as a sort of an interface or an abstraction layer that allows you to plug and play that data wherever you want it, right? So it's like a translation layer for whatever data looks like. No, go ahead.
No, so Minayo is a complete storage stack. Think of it as a complete replacement for AWS S3.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so just give us just underlying hardware, disk, CPU, and memory, and so on, and deploy Minayo on your own underlying infrastructure, and you have end-to-end software storage stack. So that's what we do with the complete storage system. It's not a translation layer. We make it very simple for customers to deploy Minayo. So maybe that's where some of the things come in, that it is a translation layer and so on, but it is a complete software stack. We make sure your data is reliable. We make sure your data is available all the time, and we make sure we deliver to you the highest performance object storage out there. So
very cool.
It's a complete object storage stack. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. All right, great. Let's stick around for the roundtable. Let's bring in our next guest. We have Gary Ogasawara from a company called Cloudian. Gary, tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing in the world of cloud storage.
Sure. Nice to be here, first of all. So I'm the CTO of Cloudian. So in the same spot as Minayo that Garima just covered, object storage. So Cloudian provides object storage software to enterprises and also service providers that power clouds. So private clouds, and then also clouds that are then resell this object storage to their end customers. And I just want to make another pitch for object storage and how critical it is now. So this covers all of unstructured data. So when we say unstructured data, it means things like photos, application log files, videos, backups, documents, all that. And would like to add that now object storage is being used more and more for structured and semi-structured data. So that means things like web logs, things like CSV files, JSON, et cetera. And for Cloudian, what our typical customer is scaling up to multiple petabytes of storage and then storing that across different data centers in different geos. So that's a very typical customer. And have a strong focus on the S3 API, Amazon's S3 API. So the whole point is that the developer can now develop their app using the S3 API, and then they don't have to be locked in to a particular cloud or a particular vendor. They could then repoint it and then have real control over their data. So that's where we've been very successful at.
Yeah, and hybrid cloud, of course, refers to having data on-prem, having data in the cloud. What do you do to be able to enable the management of those information assets? Like, give us some idea of some of the nuts and bolts of functionality that come into what Cloudian provides.
Sure. So we should first talk a bit about what we mean by hybrid, since hybrid can be multiple things. But what we've seen, as you've described at the top, Eric, is first storage was about filers on premise inside a private data center. Now, the second wave, so if that's the first wave, the second wave was really, let's put everything in the cloud, all our workloads in the cloud. And really the hybrid, the third wave, or, if we if the first wave was the thesis, the second wave, the antithesis, now we're really at the synthesis of this hybrid where people are realizing that you need to be able to work everywhere, both at the edge, inside your private data center, and inside a public cloud. And to get to your question about really what you need to enable that, then you need to have your software work at all those layers, right? So one thing that's really necessary is to have the APIs be strong, APIs be very strong and common and widespread. And the way that everyone has now converged upon the S3 API has been great. And now we're seeing these more use cases, and we're seeing also the ability to be very flexible then about where you store your data. So for example, have several customers who have some on-premise data, and then they would tier it up to AWS Glacier, for example, after 2 years. But then the access point, the advantage of object storage is you could access that data from anywhere you are. So I like to use the analogy of, if you go way back to when the internet started, it started as these private intranets, right? Companies. So there's a bunch of silos of data, and you couldn't really get from your company to another company's data. But then with the internet, you could then access by putting in a specific URL, you could then access your data anywhere. And that's what object storage provides, right? You could have one address and you could get your data, whether it's on my, LiDAR rig of my autonomous car, whether it's in my data center, or whether it's in AWS S3.
That's impressive. So basically, you're facilitating the access to data for whatever use case may be out there for the organization. And let's face it, the world is going to be significantly more federated going forward. I don't think multi-cloud is ever going away, right? You're never going to see a merger of these giants, I don't think. So you're going to have even more niche players and the big players. So it's really a question of trying to find a way to tame the environment and simplify your users' needs as much as possible, right? Real quick, Gary.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's to the point of, specialization of use cases in terms of performance and in terms of particular needs, right? So one trend we could touch on this later is what we call repatriation of data. So a lot of companies start out putting all their data in the public cloud, but then you have to pull it back for economic reasons.
Yeah, let's pick up on that after the break for the roundtable. We got our next guest coming up right after the break. Folks, send me an email. We're booking out the rest of this year right now, info@dmradio.biz. That comes right to me, and we'll get you on DM Radio. We're in a bunch of new markets now: San Francisco, Seattle, New York, Boston, Philly. It's getting pretty exciting out there, folks. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, back here on DM Radio, talking to all the experts all about storage, cloud storage, object storage, as opposed to block storage, as opposed to file storage, for example. And in the break there, Garima Kapoor of MinIO was educating me on all the latest. It's really interesting stuff. We'll have to bring that into the roundtable and have a deeper discussion on that, because it's really quite fascinating what is happening in the major players in the industry that have to pivot. We were talking about Dell, quite frankly, and how they're trying to pivot from this old world model of selling boxes for on-prem data centers and services around that to just provisioning compute and storage. That's a pretty big change, folks. That's a remarkably significant just divergence from what they've been doing. So it's going to be interesting to see how they pull that all off. And next up, we do have a company which does the sort of translation engine that I thought MinIO did, but Garima corrected me. But we have David Feller from Spectra Logic. So David, tell us a bit about yourself, Spectra Logic, and what you're doing in the cloud storage space.
You bet. So we're out of Boulder, beautiful Boulder, Colorado. Great day here today, and so we've got a little advantage over a lot of the companies here today. Is we're almost 50 years old. We've been selling storage for a long time. Started out of the dorm rooms at University of Colorado back in the 70s and 80s, and we've been doing all kinds of storage, and we've seen multiple different transitions of storage over the years. So cloud is certainly the latest, but it wasn't long ago we were talking about where would flash start playing, or what's the translation from going to tape to disk. And so we've been through all of those, and we've sold literally exabytes, almost countless exabytes. You got to think about what that means, exabytes of storage all over the world, research, genomics, pretty much any TV show or radio show that you watch probably is stored on our stuff somewhere in the world. So that's the business that we're in. But the latest thing about cloud for us is really about helping customers understand, what does this move to the cloud look like? When should I do it? How should I do it? Which cloud am I talking? And what do you mean by the cloud? Is it private or public? And how do we help our customers with that kind of a transition?
Yeah, well, that's a good way to segue into our next conversation about it, which is kind of where things have gone and where they're going and what you see in the future here. To the point of our guests earlier, the cloud is the new center of gravity, but none of these other mediums are going to go away. There's still tape storage out there for certain kinds of data that makes sense if you're not going to be using it. One of the funnier jokes I've heard about AWS, and I think they're getting better about this, but one of the consultants I know said the most ungoverned line on your IT budget is your AWS bill, because you just don't know what it's going to look like. And so that can be a minor problem at first, but it can turn into a very major problem very quickly. And I think they are getting better about having alerts and filters and looking for usage patterns that are significantly different, and then letting people know about that. So you don't come in on Monday morning and realize you've blown your entire annual budget in the first 3 months of the year, which does happen. So tell us your thoughts on how you're pivoting to be able to enable companies to leverage cloud architectures, hybrid cloud, all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah, you bet. It really is a different world. We've of course, the cloud is made of the same stuff that you normally put in your data center. So there's computers, there's big machines. We sell a lot of storage to the cloud as well. That's a big part of our business. So when you say the cloud, it's probably ending up on our stuff in the back anyway. But what's really interesting about this move is I think customers are saying we're in our second wave now. The first wave was get to the cloud as fast as you can, just go. Pick up your databases and your compute instances and move them into EC2, just lift and shift as quickly as you can. And that, of course, resulted in a little bit less architecture locally, but it resulted in exactly what you're talking about, this huge variability, unpredictability. Now what does my workflow look like? What does it cost me to actually access that data and pull it back and use it? While at the same time, the cloud guys are developing, better and better technologies. For any of you that went to the AWS, they have their reInvent show in December. Mm-hmm. Stunning. One of the best companies that puts on, what are you doing with the cloud and how do you use it? The AI that they're developing, for any given market, take media and entertainment is stunning. But how do I use that? How do I actually integrate that into my workflow? And by the way, what storage do I need on-prem? Because you always need something. There's always something left behind. And across all three companies that you have today, we all also provide on-prem cloud storage. So something that looks and feels and smells like Amazon, but is in your local data center. So there's a local aspect to it. How do I integrate that and give any user access to the data? So any user, any data from whatever location they're in. And in fact, how do I do that across multiple clouds and across multiple sites? And that's the business that Spectre's in.
Yeah. And, you brought up a couple of good points there I'd like to dive into. You've got various use cases for storage, right? Some stuff you just want to keep a backup, for example. And so you want to make sure it's clean. You don't want it to be too expensive. You want to be able to get it quickly. And it's a use case around a particular or a set of characteristics of a particular use case. But then when you start talking about storage for apps, well, that's when you want much faster storage. You want to be closer to the end user. That's why we have these availability zones. And there are certain things that just have to be very close in proximity because of physics, for example. Are you catering to all those different use cases, or do you guys specialize in one particular realm or another?
Absolutely. So, of course, like your other two guests, we can provide on-prem fast object storage. We actually have the added advantage of having file-based NAS and flash disk, whatever you need. We provide a variety of on-prem storage. But in addition to that, the question is, how do I really integrate that, and how do I make what's local work dynamically and seamlessly with what's in the cloud? So what we do really is provide a seamless interface layer. So imagine a single interface. And again, all three of us this morning are really standardizing on the AWS S3 interface. It's not an IEEE standard, but it is the default standard in the industry. Mm-hmm. That's what object storage is, and people think of object storage. But not all clouds use S3, and certainly not all on-prem storage uses S3. So what we do is provide a single S3 interface that works regardless of whether I'm talking to my local storage, or I'm talking to Amazon or Azure or Google, or there's some amazing new players in the market, Wasabi and Backblaze and other, that are providing incredible advantages, whether it's cost or accessibility. Everybody's got their unique advantages. So the problem people aren't thinking about is, what does the cloud mean? Which cloud do you mean when you say I'm moving to the cloud? Well, I want to use them all. And I want to use some services from Amazon and some from Azure. And I want to do some short-term storage in Wasabi because it's cheaper and readily accessible, but they really don't have the same kind of compute and AI that AWS does. So I want it all to just work together seamlessly. And that's the future. That's what we all should be really talking about, is this seamless multi-cloud, multi-site kind of a infrastructure that we all need to be looking towards.
Yeah, that's very interesting stuff. And I think you're hitting a nail on its head here in terms of being able to leverage what is available out there, right? So you've got this abstraction layer that you're using to basically let clients manage where the data is, access it here, access it there, and thus you're facilitating the federated view of the world. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And think about like a media and entertainment workflow. I'm going to be ingesting data. I'm going to be taking video, whether it's the morning news, the morning show, a movie, whatever it is. I'm taking it locally on a disk. I want to do some proxy. I want to keep the things that I'm using local so I can access it really quickly and edit hard on it. But I want to put all of the raw stuff up in the cloud because, if you're not aware, AWS has these unbelievably, good and creepy at the same time AI capabilities. You upload a video and they can identify almost any human in the world based on their face. You can say, hey, show me all of the frames that have a happy man with a beard, and it'll tell you exactly where those are so that you can do your editing in a real-time way. Well, you don't want to do that on 8K video. You want to do that on the proxies and then pull it back after you get the basic stuff done. So what the entire industry is trying to figure out is which pieces of that should be done locally, which pieces should be done in the cloud, and how do I make them just automatically work together? No user should have to know where their stuff is. It should just be readily available.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And let's go ahead into the roundtable here. And I want to try to map consumer examples with the enterprise examples that we're dealing with. And maybe Garima Kapoor of Minayo, I'll throw this over to you. I think to myself about file storage and guys like Apple and Microsoft and Google who've all kind of stepped into the file storage game. Like, think of your photos, right? You take all these photos and what a dramatic change we've gone through in the last 20 years with photographs, because we used to be very careful about how often we snapped that little thing on our camera because we had to get the film developed. The film it cost money to develop it. So you were very careful about that. Now we take 1,000 photos and then 10,000 photos. And now we've got like thousands and thousands of photos. And especially if it's over a few years, I can tell you from one of my older computers, I don't want to click on the icon that says, look for the file from this directory, because it's going to give me a spinning wheel for 20 minutes. So I was like, okay, guys, let's gin up the engines here and try to bring all these photos back. And then there's a latency on the thumbnails and you're like, oh, why did I do that? I have a meeting in 10 minutes. But my point being, that's a latency issue, right? Like you're using this old file system to store things, which is good. It stores that stuff, but getting it back quickly is a huge pain in the butt. And that's why we have different kinds of storage now. So with that as the sort of general metaphor, Grim, can you explain why object storage is different and what you're doing to be able to expedite the access to data that people need?
Yeah. So there are two things here, right? One is the legacy systems when we are talking about file and block storage versus the object storage and the need for the object storage overall. So I think that is one aspect that we need to touch upon. So the reason why we have to give credit to AWS in this field is that because they defined what a modern object storage needs to look like from different standards, whether it is, they did not try to go back and make file system better for these unstructured workloads or for this immutable data, right? They wrote everything from scratch and made it look like and basically made object storage and defined the object storage specs. So I think that credit needs to go there from the innovation standpoint. And as the storage has evolved, if you see, AWS came with S3 first, and then the services were built around it, right? So S3 came first, and then came the compute nodes, and then came applications, whether it is big data applications, and then file system and block storage came after S3. So S3 is the foundation of all cloud. So I think that is where the real innovation happened. And as the storage has evolved and as the scale has evolved, the S3 API has also become much more granular in terms of granting access to the certain kind of data sets, or even from the security standpoint, what kind of IAM access it needs to give, and so on. So the storage, the object storage has evolved over a period of time from how it started first, and also in terms of it catering to newer and more modern workloads. So a lot of optimizations have happened on the object storage itself. And from Minayo's standpoint, when we started, object storage was just looked as, one cheap, deep place where you just throw everything in and never get to see it again, or see it once in a while. And, you did not really mind the low performance and whatnot. So that is where I think when we started, that is how the object storage world or the object storage industry looked like. And that is where we partnered with Intel as well to optimize Minayo software in a way to make sure we take complete advantage of the underlying hardware, from whether it is from SIMD instruction set, whether it is writing the code in Go assembly, or whether it is taking advantage of the AVX 512 and whatnot. So we really went to the depth of it to make sure we get the optimal performance, because we knew that object storage is going to become or going to cater to newer workloads like big data applications like Spark or Presto, or database workloads that are going to come more natively on. So it needs to be high performant at the end of it. And that is where we did a lot of optimizations in the product itself, and we have run multiple benchmarks that anyone can easily go replicate it in the cloud itself. And in terms of the benchmarks, we are the highest performant object storage out there. If you go back and run those similar workloads with a similar set of the underlying hardware, you are going to get the complete performance from the underlying infrastructure. And so that is one innovation that we did from high performance. Secondly, make it more easily consumable and drive the day-to operations, because that is where the real skill comes into play when you're managing operations at scale. So we did a lot of investment in Minayo itself, not only to make it easy to deploy and run. So if you go to our website, like I mentioned, you can just download it in 5 minutes and get your own object storage, S3 compatible object storage. So it's that easy and simple to run. But as you scale your setup, how do you manage the underlying infrastructure? How easy it is from manageability part? That is where we did quite a bit of work, whether it is, investing in the console, GUI for admin and so on, and also make the CLI, make more and more consumable for the developers. So I think high performance and making it more and more consumable from day two standards to manage and run your operations at scale, that is where we did quite a bit of investment from Minayo's standpoint.
Yeah, that's very impressive. And I love to hear that you partnered with Intel to get right down into the weeds and understand the chipset instructions and how to leverage all that. Because a lot of people don't realize when you go to that level of granularity, you really can optimize the flow, right? And that's the key, is optimizing the flow of data, making sure it gets out the window as fast as you need it to, gets back in, or whatever the case may be. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking to several experts. What a fantastic conversation today. We've been talking to David Feller of SpectraLogic, Gary Ogasawara from a company called Cloudian, and of course, Garima Kapoor from Min.io. And Gary, I'll throw this one over to you. Again, with cloud storage, we want places to keep our data for all kinds of use cases. Maybe we may want to retrieve records, for example, or customer data, or whatever the case may be. One of those examples, use cases, is artificial intelligence, machine learning. We keep hearing about these technologies. Right. What kind of role can cloud storage play in enabling those kinds of use cases, and what does that involve?
Right. Well, it's the core of that use case. And, the way to think of it is data by itself isn't of any value, right? It's how you use that data to make decisions. And that's all this AI, machine learning, analytics workloads. And really, we've come to a point where it's a convergence of the stack where it's getting simplified, where you're getting streaming data, real-time data in, usually via Kafka. Then it goes to an object storage system, all through with S3. And then you want to do your batch processing, machine learning to improve that data. And then you have an access layer for that, which is either S3, or we've converged as well on this, we're talking about, to SQL, I think. So S3, SQL to access that data, and then that enables these data lake, data warehouse, data mesh. All these are starting to get closer and closer together. And there's still a lot of different use cases and a lot of different ways to optimize that. And different companies will have their certain advantages and different focuses on that stack. But it's really a good thing, because now, in the same way that S3 democratized object storage for all the software developers, now we're converging to a streaming convergence with Kafka, and then with the analytics with SQL. So object storage at the core of that can provide a lot of those capabilities.
Yeah, this is just fascinating stuff. It really is, and streaming is a whole new ball game as well. And maybe I'll bring I guess David Feller back in from SpectraLogic. You look around, the open source movement is amazing. It brought us Kubernetes. It brought us Kafka from Confluent. Of course, Min.io is an open source play. It's really changing how things get done. What do you think about the evolution of just building enterprise technologies and how these things are changing?
Yeah, absolutely. And the interfaces actually are converging, as we're talking about. From a storage standpoint, of course, in the we do a lot of work in high performance computing and research and that sort of thing. So there's all new file systems over there. But generally, the world is either file or it's object storage based. And we've been talking all this morning about S3 and object storage. There's some really unique advantages to object storage that a lot of companies don't think about. The ability to have multiple copies and move data around. And in fact, I can have multiple copies and multiple clouds and multiple different on-site without the user having to know. And that you can really only do that behind object storage. Mm-hmm. But what we run into a lot, and I'm sure all three companies are the same thing, you walk in and you talk about all the great advantages of object storage and S3, and it's wonderful. And they go, yeah, but 90% of my users are still just using files. So we have to also lead the way in converging those. How do we manage both file systems and object storage systems under one umbrella so that we ease the transition? Because it's not always about which is best and shove everybody into one. It's, you're going to have to figure out how to do both. And so the key to the world is being able to manipulate files, being able to handle objects in multiple clouds, and being able to make it all look like just one big global storage pool.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. And maybe let's see, I'll throw this back over to Garima to bring her back into the conversation. Horses for courses is what my old co-host used to say. You need to know what the use case is, what technology do you need to apply here. But for the big stuff, for machine learning, for AI, for really the future of business, which is at cloud scale, you need to figure out how to provision and how to be developer friendly too, right? I think that's a clever thing you folks did too, is really think about the developers, what they have to deal with, and make sure that you're making it easy as possible for them to just set that stuff up and start using it, right? Can you explain how you actually made that happen?
Yeah, I think Two things happened here. Also, the innovation from hardware caught up to where the software can really take advantage of it. So I think we do need to give credit to the hardware innovation from latency, whether it is, taking advantage of complete advantage. The networks got bigger, the drives got faster. So I think from hardware innovation, that really stepped up for the software to take advantage of. So I think that is one thing of it. Second thing that happened from application side was that, as applications are becoming more stateless, and this also ties back to, your comment about Hadoop earlier on, it being this massive giant thing that you deploy and, do all sorts of jobs and workloads on top of it. And it's a very complex system overall to manage and run. So what happened that in parallel, as the hardware was, from the innovation standpoint, it was catching up. From Hadoop standpoint, what happened because of the operational complexity and whatnot, and also the total cost involved when you are tightly coupling compute and storage together. So that, in essence, basically led to decoupling of storage and compute. So compute became stateless. It can, be spun up and down depending on your workloads from Kubernetes perspective. And the storage became centralized and it became, the object storage tier. So if you see Amazon EMR, you were talking about Snowflake earlier, they're all built on AWS S3. They're all the underlying primary storage is object storage that is powering all these applications. So now when you come to the AI ML application part, it's again, if you see TensorFlow, if you see Kubeflow, they are natively built to talk to endpoints with S3. They don't talk files. So if you go to the documentation of TensorFlow, they talk about AWS, they talk about GCP, then the third thing they talk about is MinIO. It is very simple, very clean. All the newer modern applications, they are all built for S3 first and not for file system. Now, if you, of course, there are obviously going to be certain set of class of applications and databases that are always going to stick to file system because of their legacy and the baggage and whatnot. And we as a company are not focused on that set of workload. We are focused on the more modern workloads who are coming natively to S3 object storage. And also if legacy workloads, they want to re-architect and work and make their workloads more S3 native, we are happy to work with them and make sure we give them, everything, whether it is from scalable, performant, Kubernetes native environment. We deliver all on the requirements from the storage front standpoint. But if you see, the trend is all moving towards S3 first from applications, whether it is AI ML applications or whether it is database applications, they are all coming to object storage first. And the thing about coming to object storage first is more from the perspective, it is all RESTful API, it is all HTTP, you can access it from everywhere. I think that has been the big and significant part of it from object storage popularity overall. Second part of it comes to, the scale of the data that is involved. File systems cannot scale to that kind of workload. It's just not going to scale petabytes and petabytes of data with the ease of object storage. So that's second part. The third part is about the granular policy control and access control. So all those things add up. And, if you see like 2 or 5 years from now, from how we are seeing this market evolving, more and more workloads are going to standardize. Even the legacy workloads are going to be rewritten to be S3 first workloads. So like if you see Kafka, they, with the distributed streaming engine, they have S3 first as their adapter to talk to object store. If you talk about the traditional applications, even Spark applications or Presto applications, they all have S3A connectors when it comes to talking to object storage and making sure the queries are seamless and they deliver to your internal customer requirements and whatnot. If you see Kubeflow, TensorFlow, PyTorch, Jupyter Notebook, you name it, they all have S3 first as their implementation when it comes to talking to or getting from the underlying data set. So that's what we see increasingly from our customer base and from what we see from our community as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic information. And I think you're really setting the landscape pretty clearly here that the cloud really is the future. This is a new way of doing business, and we need to sort of pivot towards being able to appreciate that. And I think we'll have a podcast bonus segment coming up here next with our guests. But it is a fascinating time to be in the world of business. And I think that one of the things we may talk about here is policies around retention, right? A lot of people want to keep that data forever because there may be some value to it. But I got to think more and more people are going to start taking a harder look at those policies and going, you know what? If that data is more than 7 years old and the policy says after 7 years, we pull the ripcord, they're going to pull that ripcord, baby, and get rid of that data and slowly march toward this new way of doing business, this new way of persisting data, of accessing data, of analyzing data, of leveraging data for the most powerful compute in the world, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning. Podcast bonus segment up next. You've been listening to DM Radio.